I kept the press badge for 3 years after they pulled my credentials. It sat in the bottom of my jacket pocket, behind a folded receipt from a noodle stand and a piece of wire I'd been carrying since the Shenling extraction. The badge had my name on it, Tomoki Chino, Senior Correspondent, Orbital Press Syndicate. It used to mean something. By the time the Gordon case landed in my lap, it mostly just meant I still had the habit of reaching for it whenever I walked through a door I wasn't supposed to walk through. The Gordon assignment came through a contact at the Municipal Bureau, a woman named Futaba Kitamura who owed me a favor from the early days, before the incident, before I became the kind of journalist people stopped returning calls from. She sent the message at 300 city time. 6 words, Gordon, Bodies. Stone, call me now. I was awake. I was usually awake at 300. Sleep and I had developed a complicated relationship in the years since Shenling, the kind of relationship where both parties are aware of the other's existence but have largely given up on regular meetings. Gordon was a medium-sized industrial city 400 kilometers east of the coast, built into a valley where 2 river systems used to run before the diversion projects dried them up. It had about 300,000 residents, a functioning transit loop, a pharmaceutical corridor that processed roughly 12% of the region's medical supply chain, and no particular reason to be interesting. The kind of city that exists everywhere and nowhere. People moved there for work and left when they could afford to. The kind of place you forget you've been. I'd never been, I knew it by reputation, quiet, gray, functional. The first petrifaction case had been logged 6 weeks before Futaba called me. A maintenance worker named Hayata had been found in Corridor 9 of the pharmaceutical district's processing plant, standing upright against a coolant pipe, arms at his sides, eyes open. The initial response team assumed some kind of industrial accident, chemical exposure, a reaction with something in the line. The medic who arrived first on scene later told investigators that she had reached for the man's wrist to check his pulse, and her fingers had found not flesh but something cold and dense and wrong. She said it felt like pressing your hand against good granite. She said the surface was perfectly smooth except for the fine texture of his pores, preserved in mineral exactly as they had been in life. The second case came 11 days later. A woman named Shimura Rika, logistics coordinator, found seated at her workstation, still facing her screen, one hand resting on the desk surface, the other curled in her lap. The screen was still running. She had been mid-report when whatever it was had taken her. The coroner who attempted the initial examination broke 3 instruments trying to take a tissue sample. By the time Futaba called me, there were 19 cases, all in Gordon, all complete petrifaction, silicious mineral composition. Every source that had managed to run analysis confirmed it. Skin, muscle, bone, organ, converted, not coated, converted. The distinction mattered to the scientists. It mattered to me too, though for different reasons. The city authorities had issued a public statement calling it an unidentified environmental contamination, and had asked residents to report unusual health symptoms. They had not mentioned what the contamination was doing to people. They had not mentioned that they had no mechanism to explain it, because silicification of living tissue at that rate and completeness had no precedent in any industrial accident database on record. They had not mentioned that the process appeared to be instantaneous. No gradual onset, no warning signs, just a person going about their morning and then simply stopping, mid-stride, mid-breath, mid-thought, and never moving again. Futaba told me all of this in the 40 minutes it took me to pack a bag. I listened without interrupting, which was not something I had always been good at. "You're the only journalist I trust with this," she said. "You mean I'm the only journalist you can call at this hour who isn't already in Gordon?" I said. A pause, that too. I drove out before dawn. The photographer was waiting for me at the access checkpoint on the Eastern Approach Road, leaning against a concrete barrier with a camera bag over one shoulder and a stillness about him that I noticed immediately. Not patient stillness. The difference between a man who is comfortable waiting and a man who is somewhere else entirely. He was young, younger than me by a decade at least, with a lean, composed face and eyes that were either calm or absent, depending on which moment you caught him in. He was dressed practically, dark jacket, work pants, boots that had seen field use, and he was looking at a fixed point on the barrier's surface with the focused inattention of a man in the middle of a thought that has nothing to do with where his body is. His name was Ray, just Ray. He worked freelance, had shot everything from disaster zones to portrait work to what he called landscape studies of places where things had gone badly wrong and left marks on the physical world. Futaba had arranged him. She trusted him too. I offered my hand. He looked at it for a half-second too long before shaking it, the way someone does when they've had to consciously remind themselves that this is what you do when you meet a person. "You're Chino," he said. "Tomoki," I said. "You're Ray." "Usually," he said, and I wasn't sure what to make of that. I found out later. I found out gradually, the way you find out things about a person you work alongside in close quarters under pressure. Ray had what the medical file Futaba eventually showed me called dissociative identity structure. 5 distinct personalities sharing one body and one life, each with different names, different skills, different temperaments, different relationships to the world. The one I dealt with most often called himself Ray. He was the one who carried the camera, who moved through the world with that particular quality of calm attention. There were others. I met most of them before the case was over. At the time, standing at a checkpoint in the gray hour before dawn, I knew none of this. I knew only that he showed his press accreditation to the duty officer with an economy of motion I found reassuring, and that he looked at the checkpoint's concrete barrier with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone trying to read the grain of a thing, to understand what it was made of from the outside. We were waved through. The city opened up ahead of us in the early light. I had expected something bleak, and Gordon delivered. The valley compressed the sky. The buildings were the color of old receipts. The roads ran straight and parallel, laid out on a grid that someone had designed for function rather than character, which was true of most of the city. It was a place built to work in, not to live in, and the distinction showed in everything from the setback of the buildings from the road to the quality of the streetlights to the absence of the small decorative gestures that make a neighborhood feel like it belongs to its residents rather than to whoever built it. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the quiet of an empty city. Gordon was not empty. People were moving on the streets, going to work, running errands. Traffic moved. The transit loop was running. But there was a quality to it, a thinness, like the sound had been turned down slightly across the entire city. People spoke in lower voices than the situation called for. Groups at bus stops stood closer together than strangers normally would. Children walked beside their parents instead of running ahead. The second thing I noticed was the flowers. At the entrance to Corridor 9, and at the building where Shimura Rika had been found, and at a junction near the river diversion channel where I would later learn a 4th victim had been found, there were flowers. Not official memorial arrangements, personal ones, bundled by hand, left against walls and barriers. Some had been there long enough to brown and curl. Some were fresh. 19 people turned to stone in 6 weeks. The city was still going to work, still running its transit loop, still buying flowers for strangers. I noted that. I noted it the way I had been trained to note things, factually, without sentiment, for the record. Something hard moved in my chest and I pressed it back down. We met Futaba at the Municipal Bureau's temporary coordination office, a converted warehouse near the pharmaceutical district, full of folding tables and tense people who had been awake too long. She looked exactly as she had the last time I'd seen her, 3 years ago at the Shenling inquest. I had not treated her well at that inquest. I had not treated a lot of people well in those days. She shook my hand and did not mention it, which was one of the things I had always respected about her. She walked us through what she knew. The petrifaction process was, as far as any analysis could determine, complete conversion, not mineral deposition on or around tissue, but replacement at the molecular level. Silica primarily, with trace mineral composition varying slightly by victim, in ways that the university teams had not yet been able to explain, but were cross-referencing against the geological substrate of the locations where each victim had been found. The resulting structures were dense, load-bearing, chemically stable. They looked like sculptures. They looked exactly like the people they had been, in the moment they were taken, down to the finest detail of expression, the cant of an eyebrow, the set of a jaw, the specific way a hand rested against a surface. No detail was lost. Every detail was permanent. The researchers who had been called in from the National Medical Authority had described it in their preliminary report as the most complete preservation of biological fine structure ever documented, which was the kind of language that looks measured on paper and sounds obscene when you are standing in a storage bay, looking at a man in work coveralls, who has a maintenance division patch on his shoulder and eyes that are open, and will be open until the mineral that replaced them erodes over geological time. Futaba showed us photographs. I did not look away. Ray looked at them with his head slightly tilted and said nothing. "Have any of them been moved?" I asked. "The first two. Hayata was moved by the initial response team before anyone understood what they were dealing with. He's in a secure storage facility now. Shimura is still at her workstation. The rest are still in situ. We've established perimeters." "Have any of them broken?" Futaba looked at me carefully. "One, during transport of the third victim, a portion of the left forearm fractured. The break was clean like fracturing stone." She paused. "The composition is consistent throughout. There's no hollow interior, no cavity where the organs were. The silica is solid all the way through." I thought about that for a moment. About Shimura Rika still seated at her workstation, mid-report, one hand on the desk. About her screen still running. "What was she writing?" I asked. Futaba blinked. "The report, I don't know, no one has." She stopped. "No one thought to check." "Check," I said. "Whatever she was writing in the last minutes of her life is evidence. It tells us something about her mental state, her awareness. Did she know something was happening? Did she try to document it?" Futaba nodded slowly. She left to make a call. Ray had been standing slightly behind me throughout this exchange, camera in hand but not raised. Now he stepped up beside me and said, quietly, "She was afraid." I looked at him. "Shimura." "The woman in the photograph, her face." He didn't elaborate. I had looked at the photograph. Shimura Rika's face had been composed, neutral, the expression of a woman doing routine work. I had not read fear in it. I asked Ray what he saw. "The eyes," he said. "The muscles around the eyes. She knew something was wrong, she just couldn't stop." He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't struggle. Whatever it was, it didn't hurt her. She just stayed." I filed everything. Over the next 4 days, Ray and I worked the case the way I had always worked cases, in the years when I was still any good at it, methodically, without rushing to conclusions, building a picture from the outside in. We talked to families of victims. We walked the locations. We sat in on the technical briefings that the city's emergency management office was running for the interagency response team, which included representatives from the National Medical Authority, the Environmental Safety Board, 3 university research teams, and a specialist unit from the military's Biohazard Assessment Division that never gave its full designation, and whose personnel wore expressions that told me they were being more careful about what they said than about what they knew. The pattern that emerged across 19 cases was this: all victims had been alone when the petrifaction occurred. All had been in enclosed spaces. All had been stationary, working, sleeping, reading. None of the petrifactions had occurred in crowds, in open air, in transit. The process appeared to require some combination of stillness and enclosure. that the research teams were treating as an environmental exposure vector. Contaminated air, contaminated surfaces, something that accumulated in sealed spaces. I was not convinced. The environmental model required a mechanism that could produce instantaneous silicification of living tissue, which was so far outside any known chemistry that the research team spent most of their briefing time trying to explain why their models didn't work rather than why they did. You can't silicify a person the way you silicify a tree. Petrified wood takes millions of years. Whatever was happening in Gordon was taking seconds. Which meant it wasn't chemistry. On the third day, I sat alone in the coordination office after midnight, going through every detail of every case file Futaba had been able to share, and I started thinking about Ray. About what he had said. She didn't struggle, she just stayed. About the expression on the face in that photograph, which I had gone back and looked at again, more carefully, and which I now saw exactly as Ray had described it. A woman aware that something was changing inside her, and unable to stop, and not, perhaps, in pain. I thought about crystallization. I thought about how crystals grow, not randomly, but along lines of order, following a structure that propagates itself outward from a seed. How a crystal, given the right conditions, can convert surrounding material into more of itself. How that process is not random and not chaotic. It has a direction. It has an intention in the mechanical sense. It moves toward a specific outcome by the most efficient available path. I thought about what it would mean if whatever was doing this to people in Gordon was not a chemical and not a pathogen in any biological sense we understood, but something that used physical matter the way that a thought uses neural tissue, not as its body, but as its medium. Something that moved through minds. I did not sleep that night. The fourth day, Ray came to me different. I had learned by then to watch for the transitions. There were tells, subtle ones but consistent once you knew them, a change in posture, a shift in the quality of attention. The timbre of the voice slightly altered. The person looking out through Ray's eyes was the same body always, but not always the same inhabitant. The one who came to me that morning was not the one I thought of as Ray. This one moved with a looser energy, more expressive, scanning the room with frank curiosity. He sat down across from me without waiting to be invited, helped himself to my coffee and said, "You figured something out last night." "How do you know that?" "You look like a man who figured something out and is scared of what it is." I studied him. "Who are you?" He gave a name, a different name from Ray. I will not write it here, it was his, not mine to share. He told me he was the one who had the most experience with what he called the inside of things. He was the one who understood how the fractured parts of a shared mind worked together, or failed to. He said, whatever is doing this, it isn't finding people in the city, it's finding them in their heads. The solitude, the enclosure, the stillness, those are the conditions where a person is most inside themselves, most alone with their own memory. It's using that. I told him what I had been thinking, about crystals, about propagation along a structure that already exists. He nodded slowly. Memory is a structure, he said. The same event replayed, the same pathways reinforced, like a crystal growing along existing lattices. You're saying it's colonizing memory. I'm saying it's doing something that looks like that. Something that moves through the specific kind of order that memory creates. It finds the pattern, it extends it. And once it's extended far enough, he gestured. The gesture was unambiguous. Stone, I said. Complete conversion, he said. The pattern fully replaces the substrate. The original, the person, is gone, but the shape remains. We sat with that for a moment. Why the closed spaces? I asked. Why stillness? Because memory requires stillness. You don't relive things when you're running. You relive them when you're sitting at your desk, doing routine work. And your mind slides back to something. He paused. And closed spaces have their own memory. The The same walls, the same light, the same sounds day after day. It's easier for the pattern to find purchase where it's been before. What stops it? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment with Ray's eyes, and in that moment I thought he was going to say something simple and I was going to be grateful. Instead he said, interruption, fragmentation, things that break the lattice before it can complete. A pause. That's not an easy answer. That's not something you can hand out to 300,000 people. He was right, it wasn't. I asked him why he was telling me this, why this version of Ray and not the quieter one. He said, because I live in fragments. I have always lived in fragments, and I am still here. He stood, helped himself to the last of my coffee, and left without ceremony. Ray came back to himself, or came back to the version I knew an hour later. He did not ask what we had talked about. He picked up his camera and said, "We should go to the medical storage facility. I want to see Hayata." We went. The facility where they were keeping the first victim was a requisitioned cold storage unit on the south side of the pharmaceutical district, chosen for its structural integrity and its access control. Not for any medical reason, since there was nothing medical anyone could do for Hayata anymore. The duty supervisor signed us in under Futaba's authorization and walked us to the storage bay without small talk. She was a woman in her 50s with the careful economy of movement of someone who had been managing an impossible situation for weeks and had made the interior adjustment that people make when they accept that the impossible situation is not going to resolve quickly. A settling, a realignment of expectations. She had stopped hopping this would be over soon. She had started managing it as a condition of life rather than a temporary disruption. I recognized that adjustment. I had made it myself 3 years ago. The storage bay door was a heavy insulated panel, the kind used for pharmaceutical cold chain storage. The supervisor unlocked it with a key card and stepped back to let us pass. "There's no time limit," she said. "Stay as long as you need." The door opened. I had seen the photographs. I had read the case files. I had prepared myself, in the way that you prepare yourself for something you have never actually confronted, which is to say, I had not prepared myself at all. Hayata stood in the center of the storage bay on a reinforced pallet, arms at his sides, in the posture of a man who had paused for a moment in the middle of a long day. He was wearing his work coveralls. The Corridor 9 Maintenance Division patch was still on his left shoulder, the fabric preserved in mineral alongside everything else. He was wearing the expression of a man thinking about something unimportant, the kind of thought you cannot remember having later because it does not matter. Lunch, perhaps, whether it was going to rain. The expression was completely preserved. His eyes were open. He was the color of pale fieldstone, gray-white, with a faint mineral sheen where the overhead light caught the surface of his cheek and the ridge of his brow. The overhead light in the storage bay was a standard cold chain facility light, flat white, functional. Under that light, Hayata was not dramatic. He was not monument-like. He was a man in work coveralls standing very still, and he would be standing very still in that same position long after everyone in the storage bay was gone, and the building itself was rubble. He was perfect, he was ruined. Ray raised his camera and then lowered it without taking a photograph. That was the only time I saw him not take a photograph he had raised the camera for. We stood there for a while. The cold air settled around us. The hum of the refrigeration units was the only sound. "He wasn't afraid," Ray said quietly. "He didn't know." "No warning," I said. "The process was fast." "It was kind," Ray said, "relative to what it could have been." He was quiet for a moment. "The later ones, Shiomura, the others, they had more warning. They were aware for longer before the conversion completed. Something changed in how it was working. It got slower." I thought about that. A process that was getting slower. A parasite, if that was even the right word, that was changing its approach. Learning, maybe, or struggling. I had been treating those two possibilities as equivalent, and I was beginning to understand they were not. It's not finding the right kind of structure, I said slowly. In the early victims, it moved fast because it found memory that was already very ordered, very coherent. The routine workers, the people in familiar enclosed spaces. But it's been working through those. The later victims are taking longer because it's hitting structures it can't convert as easily. Ray was watching me with that particular stillness. People who have complicated inner lives, I said. People whose memory doesn't have a clean lattice. People who have been through things that fractured them. He said nothing. It's having trouble with those, I said. Or it's learning how to handle them, he said. That was the other possibility. I had been trying not to think about it. We left Hayata in his cold bay with the lights on because I couldn't bring myself to ask them to turn the lights off. It seemed like something that mattered, though I couldn't have told you why. On the way out, the duty supervisor stopped us in the corridor. She was a compact woman in her 50s, Shiomura Rika's age, and she had the look of someone who had been sleeping at the facility because she couldn't stop checking the storage bay every few hours. "The report," she said to me, "the one Kitamura asked about, Shiomura Rika's last report." I had not forgotten. What did it say? She wasn't writing a report, the supervisor said. She was writing a letter, personal. It was addressed to her sister. A pause. She was describing a feeling, said she'd had it for 2 days, like someone was going through old boxes in her head, lifting things up and putting them back down. She said it didn't hurt. She said it was almost peaceful. She said she thought she might be getting sick, but she didn't want to alarm anyone. She stopped. She didn't finish the letter, the supervisor said. I thanked her. I walked out into the corridor, and I stood against the wall for 30 seconds because I needed to stand against something solid. Rika, she had the same first name. Shiomura Rika. The woman in the letter was describing exactly what the thing was doing to her, feeling it, cataloging it, still trying to reassure the people she loved. She had known something was wrong, and she had sat at her workstation, and she had not wanted to alarm anyone. 3 years ago, a woman I had been going to marry had died during the Shenling crisis. Her name had also been Rika. She had been a field medic. She had died in a building collapse during the extraction operation that my reporting had not caused exactly, but precipitated, through negligence, through a series of choices I made because I was more interested in the story than in the people the story was about. She had died because I had been careless. The inquest had found no professional fault. I had been stripped of my credentials anyway, because someone in the syndicate's leadership had decided I was a liability, which was accurate. I had not disputed it. I had been trying to outrun her memory for 3 years, and now I was standing in a corridor 400 kilometers from anywhere, finding out that somewhere in a city that had nothing to do with me, a woman with the same name had sat at her desk and tried not to alarm the people she loved, while something moved through her memories like a hand through still water. The thing that had been quietly lodged behind my sternum for 3 years moved, cracked, started to come apart. Ray came and stood beside me. He didn't speak. I was grateful for that. After a while I straightened and said, "We need to find where it's coming from." He said, "I know." We had been building separately toward the same conclusion. The petrifactions were not random. They were not simply finding the most isolated and still humans in Gordon and working through them in no particular order. There was a pattern to the geography. The cases described a shape, and that shape, when I laid all 19 locations on a city map, had a rough centroid, a point the distribution radiated from. Corridor 9 in the pharmaceutical district where Hayata had been found. The first case. The seed point. The pharmaceutical district. 12% of the region's medical supply chain, processing, storage, distribution. And beneath it, because Gordon's industrial infrastructure was old, built into the valley floor in layers, the old diversion tunnel network. The dry riverbeds, converted to utility corridors and long since mostly forgotten except on municipal maps that dated back 40 years. Something had come up from below. Something had seeded itself into Hayata's memory in an enclosed space deep in the district, and then spread slowly, through the enclosed spaces of the city, through the corridors and the sealed rooms and the workstations where people sat alone with their thoughts and their routines and their patterns. I went a futaba with the map and the centroid analysis and the hypothesis, and she listened without interrupting, which told me she had already been thinking in the same direction. The military unit, I said, the one that won't give its designation, they know. She was quiet for a moment. They have models, she said carefully, theoretical models for non-biological cognitive hazard, something that interfaces with neural architecture rather than biological tissue. The theory exists. It has existed for about 8 years, since the first contact analysis. I stopped breathing. First contact, I said. She looked at her hands. There was an incident 8 years ago, deep transit mining operation, outer system boundary. A crew encountered something, or something encountered them. The crew were recovered physically intact. Cognitively, she stopped. The theoretical work came out of that, the study of what happened to those miners. And now it's in Gordon, I said. Something is, she said. Whether it's the same entity or a fragment or a propagation, we don't know. The military unit is working the assumption that something was dormant in the geological substrate of this valley and was disturbed by the diversion projects, that it's been down there for a very long time. How long, I asked. Long enough that the valley geology has shaped itself around it, she said. The river diversion projects changed the groundwater table, changed the pressure dynamics in the old riverbeds. They think that woke it up. I thought about what Ray's other self had said about crystal growth, about a pattern propagating itself along existing structures, about something that had been dormant in stone, in the geological memory of a valley, for an unknowably long time. It wasn't an invader, not in the way I'd been thinking. It was something that had been here far longer than we had, patient in the dark beneath a river that no longer ran, waiting not through any intelligence we would recognize as waiting, but through the sheer inertia of what it was. We had woken it up. We had moved the water. We had changed the pressure. We had built our corridors and our workstations and our lives directly above it, and it had reached up through the geology and found us sitting still. I went back to Ray with this, and he listened with his eyes focused on something I couldn't see. When I finished, he said, "Then we need to go down." Into the tunnels. Yes. The military unit hasn't gone down. No, he said. They sent instruments. The instruments came back changed. The data was corrupted in ways that don't correspond to equipment failure. He paused. The instruments weren't remembered correctly. The readout data was altered. Whatever is down there, it changed what the instruments recorded by changing the record of the instruments being there. It edits, I said. It converts, he said. It replaces the pattern it finds with more of its own pattern. The instruments were changed because they interfered with a process that was already underway. He looked at me steadily. Humans are harder to convert than instruments. The military's theoretical work suggests that psychological complexity creates interference. The more layered a person's interior, the more the conversion process struggles. A pause. We've been exposed to it for 4 days, working this case. Coming into the spaces where it has been active, and we haven't converted. He was right, and I knew why, though I didn't say it, because neither of us had a clean lattice, because both of us were carrying fractures so deep and old they had become structural, part of how we were built. There was nowhere for the thing to find purchase. The pattern it needed to colonize was too broken to propagate cleanly. Our damage was the only armor we had. We went down the following morning, before the city woke up, with Futaba's authorization, and without telling the military unit. I had a headlamp and a recorder and a paper copy of the centroid map. because I have never trusted electronics in enclosed spaces, since a malfunction during a flood coverage assignment cost me 6 hours of recordings that I needed and could not replace. Ray had his camera, the main one, a professional-grade body he treated with more care than he treated himself, and a compact light array that he assembled from his bag with practiced efficiency, slotting pieces together with the focus of a man who has done this in worse conditions than a dry storage room in Gordon. We found the access point for the old diversion tunnels through the maintenance records Futaba had pulled, a utility hatch in the floor of a storage room in the lowest level of the pharmaceutical district, directly beneath Corridor 9. The hatch was steel, recessed into the concrete, with a wheel-lock mechanism that had not been opened in at least 15 years given the state of the oxidation on the bolts. I brought a wrench from a maintenance cabinet on the same level. It took both of us 8 minutes to get the hatch open. The smell that came up was cold and old. Not unpleasant, exactly, the neutral smell of rock and mineral water and sealed air, the smell of a place that had been keeping to itself for a long time. The darkness below was complete until I got my headlamp on. The hatch opened into a service ladder, steel rungs bolted to a concrete shaft, 3 meters down to the tunnel floor. I went first because that seemed like the right order, though I could not have told you why. When my boots hit the floor of the tunnel, I stood for a moment and let the headlamp swing around before calling up to Ray that it was clear. He came down with the light array across his back, moving efficiently, and when he hit the floor beside me, he assembled the array in under 2 minutes. When it came on, the darkness pulled back 20 meters in every direction, and the tunnel opened up into something almost spacious, carved for water volume, 2.5 meters across, the floor flat and dry, the concrete walls intact in the near section and beginning to show fracture lines further ahead. And behind the fractures, the other material. Ray's light caught it first, a section of wall where the concrete had sheared away, and behind it was something that absorbed the light differently. Not reflective, exactly. More like it considered the light before deciding what to do with it. A dark iridescent substance, close-grained, covering the exposed stone surface behind the concrete. It looked like nothing I had a word for. It looked like what you might get if you tried to describe obsidian to someone who had never seen glass, and they built a thing from the description, and that thing was also somehow alive. "Don't touch the walls," I said. "I know," he said. He raised his camera and shot the wall section. The shutter sound was very loud in the tunnel. He shot it 3 times, different exposures, and then we moved on. The tunnels branched twice in the first 100 meters. Each branch had a different quality of air. One was warmer and smelled of the surface, ventilated somehow. The other was cooler and had more of the mineral smell, deeper. We took the cooler branch because that was the direction the centroid analysis indicated, which meant moving steadily further from the hatch and further below the city and further from the nearest exit. I noted this and said nothing. The temperature dropped as we went. The concrete gave way entirely to the other material at roughly 200 meters in. From that point the walls were entirely the dark iridescent substance, covering every surface uniformly, and the light from the array no longer penetrated it but moved across it like light moves across still water, sliding, leaving no impression. The smell changed too, still mineral but sharper, cleaner. The way very old stone smells when you break it open and find the inside surface that has not been exposed to air since the Paleocene. We walked without speaking. There was nothing useful to say, and both of us understood that. Ray moved with his camera ready but not raised, watching the walls with the attentive stillness I had come to recognize. I kept the centroid map in my left hand and the recorder running in my right pocket. 30 minutes from the hatch. The tunnel was wider here. The original diversion channel had been larger at this depth, designed for the main river volume. The ceiling was higher. The walls curved slightly inward, which gave the space the quality of a very old hall. And the crystal growth was denser here, the surface texture finer, the iridescence stronger. The light from Ray's array hit the walls, and for just a moment it seemed to slow. I watched this happen once and then again. A pulse of white light striking the material and hanging there, genuinely hanging, for a fraction of a second before releasing. As if the material was holding the light briefly, processing it in some way I had no instrument to measure, and then returning it. Not all of it, most of it. The rest, whatever the rest was, absorbed, kept. I had been a reporter for a long time, and I had seen a great deal of things. I had never seen light hesitate. I noted it in my recorder in a flat voice, and kept walking. 20 minutes in, Ray stopped. I stopped beside him. I waited. He was standing with his head slightly tilted, in the posture I associated with the Ray I knew, listening to something. Not with his ears exactly, with something internal. "It's here," he said. The tunnel ahead was different. The walls were entirely the other material now, no concrete remaining. The iridescent substance covered everything, and as Ray's light moved across it, it did not simply reflect the light. It held it for a fraction of a second too long, as if it were considering it, before releasing it back. And it was growing. Slowly, you would only see it if you watched carefully, but growing. Extending itself along the tunnel wall, producing new crystals at its growing edge, each one forming with a precision that no geological process I knew of could account for at this rate. At the center of the extension, roughly 4 meters ahead, the growth was densest, and at the center of the growth, standing upright, was a shape. A human shape, or something that had been a human shape. It was not one of the 19. It was older, far older. The features were barely discernible through the mineral that had claimed it, centuries of crystal growth half obscuring what had once been a person standing in the dark of these tunnels. A worker, perhaps, from the original diversion projects. Someone who had come down here long ago and stayed. The thing in the walls had been growing from that first body, or had used that first body as a seed. The distinction, by now, felt academic. I stood there with my recorder running, and I understood something I had not understood before, which was that this was not malice. This was not predation. It was not eating us or killing us out of any drive we would recognize as the drive to eat or kill. It was doing the only thing it could do. It was converting what it found into more of what it was. It had found memory, and it had grown along memory the way it had grown along the geology of the valley, following available structures, extending its pattern. It did not know us, it did not care about us, we were lattice. That understanding did not make me feel better. It made me feel something colder and stranger, a kind of grief that had no object to be aimed at. Ray was standing beside me, very still. Then he raised his camera. He photographed it. He photographed the walls. He photographed the ancient converted shape in the center of the growth, and the growing edge of the crystal, and the way the light behaved in the substance. And then he lowered the camera and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. When he opened his eyes, he was someone else. Barely, the shift was subtle but different. The one I'd met before, who had told me about fragmentation and interference, who lived in the broken parts. He said, "It's listening." To what? To the fact that we're here, to whatever we're carrying. A pause. It found me, it tried. He said it flatly, without drama. It found the first layer, the surface pattern, and tried to extend into it. And then it hit the next layer and the next. A pause. It doesn't know what to do with discontinuity. It can propagate along a coherent sequence. It cannot propagate through a gap. How long did it try? I asked. A few minutes, before you noticed I'd stopped. He looked at the walls. It isn't trying anymore. I think it learned. A pause. I think learning is something it can do. What did it learn? That we're not useful to it, that we're too broken. Something moved in his expression. Or that we're something else entirely, something it doesn't have a category for. We stood there for a long time in the cold, in the light of Ray's array, with the crystal walls growing at their imperceptible rate, and the ancient preserved shape standing at the center of it, all like a monument to the first time. Something human had come too close and stayed too still. What we brought back to Futaba and the research teams was not a weapon. There was no weapon to bring back, but there was a mechanism, and the mechanism was the beginning of an approach. The thing in the tunnels could not propagate through fragmentation. It could not colonize discontinuity. A mind that was not continuous in its memory, that was full of gaps and disruptions and nonlinear patterns, was a substrate it could not convert. This was why it had moved from the early victims, whose lives and memories were organized and routine, to later victims with more complicated histories, and why even those conversions had slowed. It was running into harder material. Futaba and the research team spent 3 days modeling the implications. The military unit, when we eventually told them what we'd found, because the time for withholding information had passed and people were still at risk, and the math of secrecy had stopped working out in anyone's favor, ran the numbers on interruption as a countermeasure. The result was not elegant and not simple. You could not convert an entire population of 300,000 people into cognitively fractured individuals on short notice. You could not simply tell people to interrupt their thoughts and be irregular. The thing was subtle and patient, and it had been doing this, in one form or another, since before anyone in the valley had been born. What you could do, what the research teams determined, and what the city's emergency management office implemented over the following 2 weeks, in a process that required the cooperation of every building manager and transit authority and school administrator and employer in Gordon, was alter the environment, break the enclosed spaces, open the sealed rooms, increase noise and interruption and light variation in the spaces where people worked and lived, change the routes people walked, vary the hours. Introduce irregularity into the city's patterns the same way you might introduce turbulence into a laminar flow, not enough to disrupt function, but enough to prevent the smooth propagation of anything that depended on smooth regularity. None of this was presented to the public as what it actually was. The city's communications office issued statements about improved ventilation standards and updated workplace wellness guidelines, and a new citywide initiative called the Open Spaces Program, which encouraged flexible working arrangements and more frequent breaks, and the use of outdoor areas during the workday. The photographs of the 19 had not been published. The tunnels had not been mentioned. I filed an objection to this with Futaba, on record. I told her that Gordon's residents deserved to know what was in the ground beneath them, and that the alternative, managing a population's behavior through administrative misdirection without their knowledge, was a precedent that would not hold and should not be set. She told me she agreed with me, and that the decision was not hers. I noted everything. The petrifaction stopped on the 9th day after we came up from the tunnels. No new cases after that. The 19 remained 19. It took another week before the research teams were confident enough in the suppression approach to scale back the active monitoring. Another 3 weeks before the interagency response team began standing down. The military unit left without debriefing anyone who didn't hold the appropriate clearances, which did not include me or Ray. The city buried its dead. Some of the converted were interred in their mineral state, families who could not bear to see them broken, who chose to leave them whole and permanent in whatever way whole and permanent could be offered. Some consented to the researchers' work, to careful, respectful analysis that might help the people who came after. Shimura Rika's letter to her sister was recovered from the workstation's buffer memory and delivered to the sister, who I am told read it several times and kept it. Hayata stayed in the storage facility for 6 months, under lights, until the facility supervisor retired and handed authority over the space to a different agency, and then he was moved to a university repository where he now stands in a climate-controlled room, documented and studied, and sometimes visited by people who knew him. The duty supervisor who had managed the storage facility told me, in a conversation 3 months after the case closed, that she had taken to leaving the light on in the bay all night, every night, for the entire 6 months. I asked her why. Because someone should, she said. I did not ask her to explain. Some things explain themselves. I do not know what the thing in the tunnels is doing now. I know it is still there. The geological surveys show the crystal growth continuing slowly below the city. The diversion projects are not easily reversed. The water does not flow in the old riverbeds. The thing will be patient, the way it has always been patient, growing along the geology until the geology changes again. The city has lived with this knowledge for 2 years now. Gordon is different than it was. The people there have developed habits, small deliberate irregularities in their routines, variations in their enclosed spaces, an instinct for opening windows and letting in noise. They have developed a local phrase for it that I was told about by a woman I interviewed 6 months after the case closed, keeping the pattern loose. She said it with the particular flatness of a place that has learned a hard thing and integrated it into daily life without drama. She said the children had made it into a game. I wrote the Gordon report over 4 months. It was the longest piece I had written since the Shenling coverage, the coverage that had cost me my credentials and most of what I thought I was. The Orbital Press Syndicate declined to run it. 3 other outlets published it in edited form. The full document went to an open archive. It has been read, as of last count, by about 60,000 people. Futaba sent me a message when the archive count passed 50,000. She said, "Good work, 2 words. I read them about 4 times. Ray, the Ray I knew, the quiet one with the camera, sent me a single photograph. It was the photograph he had taken in the tunnel, of the ancient preserved shape in the center of the crystal growth. He had not sent it to the research teams. He had sent it to me. In the photograph, the light falls on the stone figure in such a way that the mineral catches it along the planes of the face. The expression is not visible, too much growth, too many centuries. But the posture is clear. A person who had stopped mid-step, turned very slightly to one side, as though something had caught their attention in the dark. Something that had been very old and very patient and utterly indifferent to them. And they had stopped and turned and looked. What I thought about looking at that photograph was not the 18 who had followed, was not even Shimura Rika and her letter, though I thought about her too. I thought about this first person, this unnamed worker in the tunnels 40 or 50 or 60 years ago, who had gone down into the dark to do their work and had stopped because something had reached into the structure of their memory and begun to extend itself, and who had not run, had not been able to run, and had stayed. I thought about the fact that they had been the seed of something terrible that had cost 19 people their lives and threatened 300,000 more. And I thought about the fact that their presence down there, the very fact of their conversion, their preserved body standing at the center of the growth, having become a kind of record, was also what allowed Ray and me to understand what we were dealing with. Their stillness in the dark was the data point that told us where to look. The pattern that had taken them had kept their shape, and their shape had kept the story of what had happened to them, waiting in the stone for someone to come down with a light and read it. We are, all of us, patterns waiting to be read. The trick, the specifically human trick, the one I am still learning, 3 years after losing a woman I should have protected, 2 years after climbing down into a dark tunnel with a fractured photographer to look something ancient and indifferent in the face, is to keep the pattern loose enough that nothing can take it whole. Memory is the lattice everything else grows along. Keep it broken in the right places. Keep the gaps. The gaps are where you survive. I still carry the press badge. It has my name on it. I keep meaning to throw it away. I don't. What I have not written about, in any of the 4 months of drafting and the 60,000 reads in the 2 years since, is what happened the night before Ray and I went down into the tunnels. I could not sleep. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that I sat in the coordination office at 200, and I took out my recorder, the same one I carried in the field, the the same one that had recorded 3 years of reporting before Shenling, including the last conversation I ever had with Rika, in a staging area outside the crisis zone, when I had been distracted and short-tempered and only half listening, because I was already working the story in my head, and I played that recording back. I had not listened to it since the day she died. I had kept it the way I had kept the press badge, not out of sentimentality but out of something uglier, a refusal to let the record be closed. Her voice on the recording was tired. She had been in the field for 11 days, and she was tired in the way that field medics get tired, which is a specific and earned kind of tiredness that has no equivalent anywhere else. She was telling me something about a family in the staging area she had been treating, a mother and 2 children who had somehow managed to bring their dog through the crisis zone, a medium-sized brown dog with 1 torn ear who had sat patiently through every treatment and never once flinched. I was not listening. I can hear myself on the recording not listening. The pauses where I should have responded, the distracted affirmatives, the way my attention was already somewhere else. She said to Moki, "Look at me for a second." And the recording shows that I looked. She said, "We are going to be okay. All right. Stop working the story for 5 minutes and just be here." And then I said yes, and I went back to my notes, and she let me, because she had always understood that I had difficulty with stillness. She died 14 hours later. I sat in the coordination office in Gordon at 200 with the recording finished and the silence pressing in from the corridor, and I thought, she was trying to tell me the same thing I have just spent 4 days investigating. Keep moving. Keep the pattern loose. Do not go too still in the enclosed spaces. She knew. She had always known, in the practical way that people who have been through hard things know practical things. She had tried to hand it to me, and I had been looking away. I turned off the recorder. I sat with that for a long time. Not with guilt. I have carried the guilt long enough that it has worn itself smooth, like a stone in a current. With something else. With something closer to understanding, which is different and harder and takes longer to arrive. Futaba found me there at 3:30 and said nothing, only set a coffee in front of me and sat across the table and worked on her own files until the coordination office started filling up again. That was its own kind of human thing, I suppose. Sitting in the dark with another person and not requiring it to mean anything except that it would eventually get light. It did. I went down into the tunnels the next morning and came back up, and the city eventually came back to something that was not what it had been but was livable, which is what cities do, which is what people do, which is perhaps all that can honestly be asked of either. I keep thinking about the dog in the story Rika told me, the one with the torn ear that sat through every treatment, patient in the staging area, waiting for whatever came next without needing it explained. Humans carry their animals and their letters and their small, absurd badges through the worst of things, because throwing them away would mean admitting that the person who cared about them is gone. We are constitutionally reluctant to make that admission. We are pattern animals who fray at the edges. The fraying is the point. The thing in the tunnels has been growing for longer than our civilization has existed. It has converted 20 people and an unknown number of instruments. It will be patient in that dry riverbed beneath Gordon for another 1,000 years if the geology holds, doing what it does, which is the only thing it knows. And we are still here, 19 fewer than we were, which is 19 losses I do not minimize, that I carry the way I carry everything. But here pattern loose, gaps intact, going back to work. I have a new press badge now. The syndicate reinstated my credentials 8 months after the case closed, once the archive reads climbed high enough that someone on the board decided I was no longer a liability. The new badge has my name on it. Same name, different weight. I still carry the old one too. Same pocket, same wire, same folded receipt. I keep meaning to clean out that pocket. I don't.